Saludos, it's your host, Gabe Morales, coming back at you with another episode of Mexican Mafia members over the past 60 plus years. I think things have been going pretty good, but there seem to be a few haters left. Just in case you didn't get the message, you are not allowed. Pa fuera. Get along down the road. There's plenty of other channels you can watch and criticize. For the most part, I've been getting some positive feedback and some good suggestions. Just as a reminder, everybody I mentioned here has been validated by at least one law enforcement agency, usually multiple law enforcement agencies, as either being a member or a close associate or camarada of La M. As I do not comment on current status, that could mean they're a dropout. It could even mean they're deceased, or it could mean they're active. I try not to speak on such things and stay out of penitentiary politics. I leave that up to other channels. As many of you know, a well-known Mexican Mafia member from Colonia Oxnard, Martin Evo, aka Maldito Madrigal Casares, was recently killed down in a Baja California prison. I won't talk about him either, or how Mexican police intel authorities, who I converse with frequently, believe that went down. I'll leave that to other channels. Often, when something happens, other channels will jump right on it before the dust is even settled, and they make claims that turn out to be totally false. I'm not going to add fuel to the fire. Like I said, I'm just going to stay out of those kind of things. Almost everything I talk about is old news. So if you're looking for some fresh chisme, this is the wrong place to get it. Also, some of you guys have asked about individuals who haven't got to yet. I'm going through the alphabet A through Z, not by moniker, not by clica, not by first name, but by last name. And so today we'll start off with the H's. The first one is Billy Hale, aka Chivo, from Compton Barrio Tres. I believe he had a B number. Was very active at Folsom Prison back in the 1970s, where this picture was taken. I believe he was later moved to CMC, which sometimes has the reputation for being a dropout yard, but not always. Hale was close to Haas Frisbee, a former Emma member who went with the 2 5s, or pesetas. I also show that he went to Hatchapi and that he overdosed after he was released. There was John Green Eyes Holman from San Diego. He had a C number, 89835, and was pegged by law enforcement as being Mexican Mafia, at least in the 1990s, and I believe he was active until at least 2004. There's Brian Joker Harris from Cantaranas. I show he was active in CDC, but was shot at Corcoran Prison on December 28th, 2004. Corcoran had a pretty big reputation for setting up inmate fights, as was shown in the movie Felon. If you're interested in that time frame, you can check out my video on the Green Wall that talks about that. I am the first one to admit there are some very sadistic and corrupt guards. But to be honest, I didn't see much of that around me, because what these individuals do is they test other officers, see what their reaction is on a small violation of the rules. And then if they laugh or even join in, then they know that these guys are crooked as they are. If you tell them to knock it off, like I often did, or intervene, then you're not to be trusted, and they just won't do it around you. That's what I found most of the time with me. Sometimes convicts can get under your skin and get you to do things out of character. But there's a lot of times where I stepped in with officers and they got mad that I stopped them. I told them, hey, think for a minute, de-escalate, don't get so angry. These guys are going to push your buttons if you let them. And even though you're probably mad at me right now, you're probably going to thank me later because I just saved your job. Anyways, that's a different subject. Like I said, watch the Green Wall. There's other videos out there on crooked cops. I did a whole series on crooked cops because some of you guys are brought up. What about you guys? Like I said, I'll be the first one to admit there's some crooked people on both sides. It really comes down to character. The next individual I'll talk about is Aaron Güero Heflin. I believe he was from Compton Barrio Segundo. He had an E number, and I believe was in the homicide of an officer on the streets. I show his house at Pelican Bay in 2012. I show Heflin is currently housed at SATF in Corcoran. Catarino Gato Heredia, I show had an H number. So he was probably made MA sometime around the time I left in 1993. I show he was housed at Pelican Bay in 2012 and is currently housed at Lancaster. Ernie Termite Heredia from East LA had a C number. So it was likely made MA sometime in the 1980s. I show he was still validated as of 2004. But is currently not in custody. Abraham, a.k.a. Ice, a.k.a. A.B. Hernandez, is a longtime Mexican Mafia member with an A number, having been born in 1942. AB was not an original member, but was a very early member and was close to Mike Acha Ison, Big D Garcia, and other Mexican Mafia heavyweights of the 1960s and 70s. He was involved in the Elian Delia hit. In other words, he was in the same car when she was killed and her body dumped by the Sacramento airport. Being that AB is from Sacra, he was probably used as intelligence for logistics. AB often utilized his wife Ana to conduct M business. He has been incarcerated for most of his life and has some unusual tattoos, as seen here, including a half face of Jesus and half face of a devil, probably signifying his life. Also, he has a very large 13 with a 5-pointed star above. As most of you guys know, the 5-pointed star is often associated with norteños. I'm not sure if he put that on because he's from Northern California or what, but other places use that, like Orange County, so don't be confused by that. The 13, however, was probably put on after the Sureño movement, because when the MA first started, there were no Sureños. Go ahead and listen to other channels, other people's versions. I spoke to convicts and gang investigators, and there is no mention of Sureño in any documentation until the late 1970s. The norteños were first mentioned in the mid-70s, and then the sureños shortly after that as a counter movement. As the MA and West Familia got locked down in the security housing units in the late 1970s, they used this sureño and norteño movement as a recruitment pool. But contrary to what some people state, not all sureños are foot soldiers for the Mexican Mafia. Only a very select few. In fact, it is believed that the active membership in the organization today is less than a couple hundred. So go ahead and believe whatever you heard, or do your own research. Ask some of the veteranos, or if you're a young officer, ask some of the old school guys that actually were working back in the 60s and 70s, and get their thoughts. Anyways, last I checked, AB was still alive, but would be in his early 80s today. Arthur Taco Hernandez was from Montebello. He had a C number as well as a J number. I show he was just an associate in the 1970s, but was made MA sometime in the mid-1980s. He went to CRC and then got released, got popped on a parole violation in 95, whereby he was given his J number. He was in and out in the late 1990s. I show he's currently no longer in custody. Donald Slugger Hernandez was from San Pedro. He was affiliated with the MA in the federal system and was released in November 2004. Frank Pancho Hernandez was from Primera Flats. He had a B number, 22828, was just a camarada, but I understand that he was made MA in the feds, but was assaulted and soon dropped out. Let me know what you heard about on that. Fred, aka Freddie Hernandez, was from Ontario Black Angels. He had an E number, was active in the early 90s, and I'm not sure about his activity in recent years. Henry Canton Hernandez was from Garrity Loma. He had an A number, 70338. Was born in 1937. He was another individual like AB who joined the MA early on. And I showed died from tire iron blows, I believe behind a dope deal involving Joe Morgan. Israel Flaco Hernandez had a J number and was involved in the organization while he was incarcerated, but I show was released from custody and must have came back on a parole violation because I show he's currently at Solano. Jesus Chino Hernandez was one of the growing number of MA members from Northern California. He was out of Modesto and had an E number, although I think he probably was incarcerated before that. I showed that he went to death row in the early 90s and was sponsored by Chato Sandoval and the Ayala brothers. He then won his appeal and was shipped to Pelican Bay, where he was active in the SHU until at least 2021. He may have been released or possibly deceased because I show he's no longer in custody. Joseph Shaky Joe Hernandez was from 18th Street. He was a well-known dope dealer in LA and got caught up in that RICO case in the mid-90s. I believe he was just a camarada, but I show was housed at Marion in 1997 and then at Florence in 2003. Joseph Hernandez is currently 60 years old and his whereabouts are unknown. Juan Choloton Hernandez was from Compton, 155s, which is one of many old barrios in Compton, but his place of birth was Mexico. Although many people think of Compton as being a predominantly African-American city, it also has a large Hispanic population. I show Choloton was involved in multiple homicides in CDC, and he was also present with AB when Ellen Delia was killed in Sacramento. He ended up rolling after that case and I understand was deported to Tijuana and disappeared off the radar. Othan Ghost Hernandez, I believe, was from Los. I show he was close to Psycho Mendez and was sent to the feds. He did time at USP Lee and was released in April 2019. Ramon, aka Mad Dog Hernandez, was from Norwalk. and was active at Folsom Prison in the 1970s. Richard Richie Hernandez was from Paramount. He was involved in a bank robbery in Hawthorne with several other Mexican Mafia members of approximately $10,000. Also involved was Donald Stoney Galas from Rancho San Pedro, Marcelo Gabi, a.k.a. Pistolero Baeza from Florencia 13, Joe Mendez, and Nora Valles, who was the wife of Alberto Beto Valles. These individuals ended up getting into a shootout with police, and Hernandez was killed and Mendez was wounded. The stolen money was recovered by police at the scene. Robert Lobo Hernandez was from Primera Flats. He was a big dope dealer in the 1970s and worked for Joe Morgan and one of Joe's main connections, Harry Gamboa Buckley, but I believe eventually dropped out when he got too deep. Rodolfo Rudy Hernandez was from East LA. I'm not sure if he claimed a specific barrio there, but a lot of early MA members were out of East Los. He had a B number, 57810, was active in the MA in the 1970s. I believe he was an enforcer for La MA and worked with Chispas Sandoval's Community Concern Program. Rolando Rolo Hernandez was from Los and had an A number as well as an E number. He was a dope dealer going back to the 1950s, having been born in 1938. I show that he went to Lompoc in the late 1970s, and I'm unsure of his current whereabouts. Most likely is now deceased. And finally, we have Reuben Tupi Hernandez, who I probably will do an entire episode on, as there's so much to talk about there. His wife was Tonya, and they were both known as being pretty ruthless there. I'd frequent Sunkist Street quite a bit. I remember sometimes getting tacos de cabeza there at a little Mexican place. If you guys know what I'm talking about, it's not too far off of Mission and Euclid on Sunkist, right there in the barrio. This is the same area where Tupi was involved in multiple homicides in 1987, and it was covered extensively by my friend, investigative reporter Chris Blatchford. Tupi was involved in a robbery in 1978 and processed at CIM in 1979. He got out and then was reclassified at CIM Chino in 1982. As I mentioned in previous episodes, he was involved in the hit on Mo Farrell, whereby he held the door while Stump Valencia and Danny Boy Pena stabbed Farrell repeatedly. Believe it or not, Tupi got off on that one and paroled in 1986. He committed multiple robberies in 1987, and while he was out on the streets in the 1980s, he recruited a lot of guys for the MA. A lot of people were scared of Tupi. Like I said, he was ruthless. In 1987, after completing his 8-year sentence for robbery, Tupi brutally beat and executed a woman he believed was responsible for the murder of a fellow Black Angels member. He also killed her roommate and her boyfriend. At the time, authorities called it the most brazen gang-related act in the violent gang history of the Inland Empire. On the morning of June 22, 1987, Tupi entered the home of Mary Lou Davia Salazar on Ontario and savagely beat and executed not only her, but her young roommate and boyfriend. After the Salazar murder, police immediately determined that Tupi was responsible, and within 48 hours, was arrested and behind bars. Convicted of the triple homicide, Tupi received a life sentence for each of his victims. As I mentioned before, after this occurred, Tupi was considered to be one of the top guys in the MA. Tupi communicated often with fellow Ontario Black Angels Daryl Castrillon and Mando Barajas. At the same time, Juvenal Soto Vega, a.k.a. Kenny, and Ronald Turtle Baeza were handling street operations, which mostly consisted of a large meth operation that was eventually taken down. I understand that Frankie B. Buelna started to encroach on Tupi's territory, and Antonia, Tupi's wife, as well as his mom, Jovita Huizar, were complaining to him about that. Tupi became very excited when his associate, Charlene Chavez, won the California lottery. Right away, put a plan in place to use her money for MA business. Part of that plan meant divorcing her husband, MA member Philip Chano Chavez, and then hooking up with Tupi's half-brother, Joseph Kiwi Corralejo, and Dashing D. Castrillon was part of that conspiracy, as he and Tupi were cellmates. Oddly enough, it was Dashing D who ultimately ended up marrying Charlene. But what comes around goes around, and eventually a lot of guys got upset with him. And after he was indicted on the RICO in 1995, he was hit at the LA Metro Detention Center on October 17, 1996. A lot of these guys went to feds, but it appears he ended up going to Pelican Bay during the late 1990s. In all that time, even though he was in trouble, he pleaded with his carnales to let him back in to the organization in good standings, an organization he killed for, almost died for. But I understand they terrorized his family. And even though the inmate comes first, even before your family, I'm sure this bothered him quite a bit. Tupi ended up ODing or died from cancer. I've heard both stories at Terminal Island in 2007. And that concludes part 1, H last names. I hope you learned something new and come back to watch more episodes as we continue to dwell into the activities of this organization that has hurt many families and ruined many lives. For now, this is Gabe Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.
When your eyes